Well, good Monday evening. Meteorologist Evan Stewart here. It is the 22nd of June. You've found us here on Hurricane Hub Live. We do it every weekday here through hurricane season. And just fair warning as we start things off, that I'm reporting from Norfolk, Virginia. And we do have the threat of severe weather in the area. So there is the potential that this episode of Hurricane Hub Live could be cut a little bit short as we have to transition to local coverage of the severe weather that is potentially moving into our area. We do have a severe thunderstorm watch for parts of our cities and counties here in eastern Virginia and North Carolina. But let's talk about the Hurricane Hub headlines here on this 22nd of June. Right now, all is quiet in the Atlantic Ocean. We don't have anything that even has a little bit of a swirl that could potentially develop into a tropical system that we're watching. However, we are watching the Pacific because there is the potential for some development in the Pacific Ocean. And then if we have time, we have a repeat of the interview that Tim did last week, talking with some experts at ODU about climate resilience here through eastern Virginia and North Carolina. Again, that's if we don't get interrupted by severe weather, as we do have some warnings just on the outskirts of our area. As you know, hurricane season began on June 1st here in the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the Gulf, and we've already had our first named storm. That was Arthur, that formed last week very briefly and really brought a bunch of rain through parts of Texas and Louisiana. Had some issues with some flooding there along the Gulf Coast. Only a short-lived storm, lasted about 24 hours, I think, before it moved inland and then eventually weakened. And that's what brought us some of the heavy rain last Thursday night and Friday morning that cleared out just in time for the big HarborFest 50th anniversary here in Norfolk, Virginia. Sail 250, as you might have heard, as those ships are now, right at this moment, I can hear the tugboats and the horns blowing as they are now departing the port of Hampton Roads and heading up the Chesapeake Bay up towards Baltimore, and then eventually up towards New York City for the 4th of July. The other names on our list, our next named storm, which again, there's nothing out there in the Atlantic right now, would be named Bertha, and then Cristobal, Dolly, Edward, Faye, Gonzalo, Hannah, Isaias, Josephine, Kyle, Leah, Marco, Nana, Omar, Paulette, Renee, Sally, Teddy, Vicky, and Wilfred. Those are the names in the Atlantic Hurricane Basin. And again, as I mentioned right now, things are very quiet through the Atlantic. We do have, a little swirl up in the North Atlantic and some, a little bit of activity down here through the intertropical convergence zone, but we're not expecting any development here in the Atlantic over the next 7 days. And one of the reasons is typically as we get here into June and early July, we have a lot of dust coming in off the Sahara. It's what we call the Saharan dust layer. And it's not just the dust that is in the atmosphere, it's also that it's very dry air. And of course, if you know anything about tropical systems, you know that they need moisture to work with. You need very warm water temperatures over 80 degrees. And you also need a lot of moisture in the atmosphere. And that dry air, once it gets pulled into a tropical system, really just, destroys it. And with a lot of dry air here, and that Saharan dust coming off the African continent, that really does inhibit the growth development of tropical systems in the Atlantic Basin, and especially in the areas where we see most of that development here coming off the coast of Africa and working its way through the intertropical convergence zone, that main development region here. And again, you can see the forecast that carries us all the way through July 2nd, and it's just a lot of dust and a lot of dry air. And that's why we're not expecting much here into the Atlantic as we go over the coming days and really the next week, because there's just a lot of that dry air and that Saharan dust that is being pulled into the upper parts of the atmosphere. And that extends eventually over towards areas of the Caribbean. And when we talk about the peak of Atlantic hurricane season, that comes all the way on September 10th. So you can see here as we start out in June, typically we don't see a lot of development here. And even into the beginning of July, it's fairly low activity and really doesn't start to kick up until August. And that's in a typical hurricane season. And these are the average number of storms per 100 years from 1944 all the way into 2020. So we still have a little ways to go. Some of the main areas that we watch for that development in June, a lot of times because of all of that Saharan dust, we see tropical development here in the Gulf, which is something that we saw, of course, with Arthur last week, getting into the Caribbean and especially the western parts of the Caribbean, and then there's the potential for development here through the Bahamas and off the southeast coastline. More of these homegrown storms just because of that dry air that gets pulled into these systems that were, as they come off the coast of Africa. These are the areas where the water's a little bit warmer and you have the better chance of development. But as of right now, we're not looking at anything here in the Atlantic. Now, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about the Pacific Ocean, and there are a couple of areas that we're watching for potential development there. Welcome back to Hurricane Hub Live as we transition from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, and we're looking at sea surface temperature anomalies. That's what SST stands for, and where you see these warmer colors, that's where ocean water temperatures are well above average. Of course, that's the El Nino that we've been talking about, the potential even for a super El Nino. And when you have a strong El Nino pattern setting up here, that's the warm waters of the Pacific, it typically tends to inhibit or reduce activity in the Atlantic, but accelerate or increase activity here in the Pacific Ocean. And it's already been a little bit of an active season here in the Pacific. As of right now, we're not tracking anything, down towards where some of those warmer waters are, but there are a couple of systems here that have some low-end chances of development. You can see one little swirl there, another little swirl. And these are sort of some overlapping areas, so we'll get rid of one of them. And this area right in here is just a regular old area of low pressure that, as of right now, is expected to develop over the coming days. It's some of this disturbed weather out here. Right now has a 0% chance of development over the next 2 days, but as it moves off towards the west, it'll enter an area that has a little bit more of a favorable pattern for the development. So the National Hurricane Center is saying there's about a 30% chance of development with this system coming up here over the next 7 days. This low pressure, though, has a little bit of a better chance, a 30% chance of development within the next 2 days, and then maybe a 30% chance of development within the next 7. Eventually, it'll enter into an area that is a little less conducive for development. And the good news with both of these systems is they're well off the coast of Central America and Mexico. Now, when we come back, Chief Meteorologist Tim Pandagis has an interview with an ODU resilience expert on climate and how that might impact us here in Hampton Roads.
Jess Whitehead joins us, and I want to get this right, Jess. You're the executive director of Old Dominion University's Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience. ICAR for short. We like our acronyms here.
We do love our acronyms.
And welcome to the show.
Meteorologists love some acronyms.
We do. Science in general, right? Loves the acronyms. So, Jess, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about what the Institute at ODU does. And for our viewers, ODU, Old Dominion, is located right here in Norfolk, Virginia.
Thank you for that. So the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience is really unique in that we focus on the practice of building coastal resilience. So we partner with communities, with localities, organizations, businesses to engage, understand their needs, and then develop and deploy real solutions based on integrative, innovative, and applied research. So we really see ourselves in the university as a catalyst in the Hampton Roads region and for all of coastal Virginia to make sure that we have thriving communities no matter what Mother Nature throws at us.
Now, it seems like it's great placement for ICAR here in Hampton Roads. As we talked about before the show, it's one of the most susceptible coastal regions along the eastern seaboard. And explain to viewers why that is.
Absolutely. We are right at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. And so we have historically for hundreds of years, and even going back to when the many tribes in Virginia were here, it has always been an important location. Right at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, extremely strategic. Today we have the world's largest naval base. We have the Port of Virginia. We have 7 different cities in our region. We have 17 localities overall in the Hampton Roads Planning District region, and some of the most historic sites in the United States. We also have one of the highest rates of sea level rise in the United States and the highest rate on the East Coast. So that means that as we go forward into the future, floods that we may have seen in the past have the potential to be higher as the baseline sea level is increasing, as well as the vertical land motion from our land sinking on top of that. So we've got that 1-2 punch going on.
Really a double whammy with the subsidence out there. So I brought this up when we talked before the show. Is that a big contributing factor to the sinking of the land across Hampton Roads is that Chesapeake Bay meteor impact?
Yeah, we've got the meteor impact. We've also got water extraction going on for our industries here. So those two, again, kind of lead to that compaction. Right now, it's probably about 1/3 of our relative sea level rise. As we look forward into the future, you would begin to expect to see that global rate, the relative rate that you see from things like ice melting that's currently locked up on land or changes in ocean circulation becoming a larger component than the subsidence.
Now, I just want to clarify, because that meteor impact, you didn't miss it. That was 35 million years ago, so it's a long, long time ago.
Good.
But let's get into the flooding aspect of things here, Jess. How do institutions get into drawing the flood maps? You know, they're very intricate here in Hampton Roads, and it can be different from your neighbor just down the street from what your flood zone is. So what kind of goes into that? What do folks look at to draw those?
Yeah, so the Federal Emergency Management Agency is the entity that is really going through and approving these maps. And really what they're looking at is what we call H&H, hydrology and hydraulics. So the hydrology is what's the water. For us, a lot of that is the probabilities of certain storm surges, the addition of wave action that might do damage on top of that storm surge, and then the hydraulics of how that water moves through the landscape. So it's a really complicated engineering exercise. Interestingly, we now have private companies that are doing this more and more often and starting to get some different results by really taking modeling approaches to this and trying to get a handle on some factors that are harder for these engineering studies to capture, like really big rainfalls and what happens when you have one of those lower probability but high consequence kind of rainfalls interacting with things like our stormwater infrastructure. So that's really a cool science question of why do we still do science on this? the FEMA flood maps don't couple to the stormwater infrastructure, and we know that the cities have modified so that they are relieving flooding in some areas, and then things happen like leaves back up a storm drain and you might have flooding in a new area. So there's a whole lot of research going into how to do flood modeling better, but right now, the real kind of jurisdictional process that holds sway with your mortgage company, which is what everybody at home cares about, is that FEMA process.
All right, very interesting. So, Jess, what are some proven tactics for mitigation of storm impacts from either a hurricane, a nor'easter here in Hampton Roads, or like what are some ways, some interesting ways that cities and municipalities are adapting to the rising sea level change and overall more impacts from storms?
So that is a really broad question, Tim. I think most people understand the concept of a seawall or a bulkhead. That's kind of traditionally, if we go back in history, how we handled that stuff. Let's stick up a big wall. Sometimes there are challenges in that, and sometimes that's the only thing you can do. If you are in a river channel and you have really big ships that go back and forth, a wall is your option. But sometimes if you're a homeowner, you may be living in an area where you want to put up a bulkhead on your property. When you get wave action in these storms, it'll start to scour in front of that and begin to erode the integrity of that wall and start to see that failure. So a lot of what we focus on in ICAR, and in particularly in our partnerships with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, is how do we use nature to work with us and help out in some of these circumstances. Sometimes, and in Virginia, it's actually, if you go into code, it's the preference. You have to prove, you use a living shoreline or prove that you can't use one. And those are more natural techniques that use vegetation, that use different kinds of materials that allow oysters to build up in certain areas. Those are things that aren't going to stop a 15-foot storm surge, but they definitely help with things like dampening down wave action. And in some cases, in places like North Carolina, where they've had recent big storms like Hurricane Florence in 2018, they've been able to find out that these living shorelines end up having less damage after a storm. But it's really dependent on where you live and the conditions of what you're trying to protect. So we work a lot with when can you use those natural and nature-based solutions primarily, and when do you have to use them in hybrid approaches so that your gray approaches, like you have to have a seawall, aren't doing as much damage to the natural environment and the habitat. And that's some of the coolest, most enjoyable work that we do, and it crosses all of the disciplines. We've got people who are, we have research faculty within ICAR who are working with ODU's Civil and Environmental Engineering Department to build a wave flume that will allow us to test different vegetation types and see how wave action gets dampened by different types of plants. But then we also have people in our biological sciences who are partnering with people in the School of Business. Right now, when you go and all of these cities are trying to put in more of these nature-based solutions, there's one nursery in New Jersey supplying the plants. So they're trying to figure out how do we work in Virginia to make this an attractive business proposition and something that will work so that we can be growing those in Virginia. So there's all kinds of different ways that we're working. And the coolest thing about ICAR is being able to be that hub where all of these faculty from different departments can be working with people from the cities and collaborating with them to get things on the ground and make sure it's, data to decision.
Now, artificial intelligence is becoming more and more embedded in what I do with meteorology and weather forecasting and model prediction. I'm interested to hear how that's coming into play with maybe modeling storm scenarios for mitigation purposes or adaptation for coastal communities. How are you guys using it?
Yeah, so right now, we're really, I think, on the forefront of beginning to experiment with how AI can be a value add in these processes. You're absolutely right. A lot of it has been in the modeling arena, particularly in getting into flood modeling, developing better flood maps, doing those really difficult data-intensive things like coupling that stormwater infrastructure or determining how we layer up these solutions. I think a lot of the future is also going to be in helping planners make better decisions. When you are working for a locality and you're making a decision about a project, it's not just the science that comes into it, it's the planning, it's the zoning, it's the economics and the benefit cost. It's really hard right now to synthesize all of those different data points really and modeling into something that's useful. And I think that that's somewhere where AI can be of a benefit and something that will help planners be able to process a lot more information than they can currently when they're having to make these decisions.
Now, real quick, before I let you go,
Yeah.
what's the most overlooked preparedness in regard to hurricane preparedness measure that you think people just forget about?
Buy flood insurance. 100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely no. And right now, there are no storms in the Atlantic, assuming that we don't see Arthur 2.0 out of some very, very tiny chance. But there's a 30-day waiting period when you purchase federal flood insurance. So now is the best time to price a policy. Your homeowner's insurance does not include flood. You've got to buy it separately.
Now, do you think it's necessary even if you're not in a flood zone?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, when we look nationally, it runs somewhere between 26 and 30% of flood damage is happening outside of these mapped flood zones. And it's because of all of these other factors that are harder to layer on together. We especially saw that in a lot of places in Hurricane Helene, in Southwest Virginia, Western North Carolina, flooding outside of those mapped flood zones. So if you see water from your house, if it rains at your house, it can flood if you get enough of it. So buy that flood insurance. And if you're not inside X zone, or I'm sorry, if you're inside the X zone, that area that's outside of a mapped floodplain, you're going to get the best price. And in a lot of the Hampton Roads localities, they participate in the community rating system, which gets you anywhere with our localities between a 15 to a 25% discount on that rate.
Fascinating. All right, thank you so much, Jess Whitehead, Executive Director, ODU Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience. Really appreciate having you on the show.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's been a pleasure.
All right, we'll be right back.
Thanks for sticking with us here on Hurricane Hub Live. We're now going to toss things over to meteorologist Craig Moeller. He has an in-depth look at the 5 major hazards that come with hurricanes.
There are 5 major hazards associated with hurricanes. The first, storm surge. Storm surge is the abnormal rise of water produced by a storm's winds. Storm size, central pressure, and the wind's forward motion, angle of approach, and coastal features all impact the amount of storm surge a system has at landfall. Historically, storm surges cause the most destruction to property, coastline, and loss of life with landfalling tropical systems. More recently, flooding from rainfall is the most frequent cause of death from tropical systems. This is likely due to the improvements in forecasting and communication, earlier warnings, and the ability to better evacuate coastal areas over the past few decades. Heavy tropical rain commonly produces flooding and can trigger landslides and flash flooding for areas well inland. High sustained winds that switch directions as a storm passes can bring down structures, trees, and power lines. Isolated spit-up tornadoes are common as powerful squalls move over land. And finally, high waves and rip currents can threaten the lives of beachgoers even when storms are centered hundreds of miles offshore.
All right, thank you very much, Craig. For more information as hurricane season continues, visit the 13 News Now Hurricane Fast Facts playlist on YouTube. You can get to it by scanning the QR code on your screen right there, or you can find information on supplies that you should have on hand, emergency resources, storm facts, and more right there on those Fast Facts pages on our YouTube playlist. And of course, we also have the 13 News Now Hurricane Guide. Scan the QR code to download the guide. It has information on supplies you should have on hand for emergency numbers that you might need and a whole lot more. Thanks for joining us on Hurricane Hub Live.